everyone. Welcome to this afternoon webinar. We are today going to do a full end-to-end BizTalk to Azure migration deep dive, which is a bit of a mouthful. As you know, if you've been following us, we do a lot of migrations of legacy technology onto Azure, onto modern cloud platform. And this is just another in that series, but we've gradually started off at the high level, talking about the business need and the very conceptual approach, and now we are getting on to the real meat of it, which is the nuts and bolts of how this happens. So just to give you some introductions, I'm Andrew Rivers, I'm CEO of 345 Technology, and I have with me David Robinson, who is a principal consultant with us, massively experienced in both BizTalk and Azure and all things. I mean, there isn't a lot Dave doesn't know. And Dave's going to take us through a lot of the detail on this today. So in this session, who's it aimed at? I mean, there's two main audience. One is if you've actually got to do hands-on technical stuff, and maybe you're an architect, an enterprise architect, a solution architect, or maybe you're actually implementing and developing solutions. A lot of good stuff for you. But also, if you're a technology decision maker, if you're in the IT leadership, and you have BizTalk in your estate, then this is giving you an understanding of what's actually involved, so that when you come to plan the migration of this technology, you've got a better idea of what to do. But we do assume that you're at least slightly familiar with BizTalk, not necessarily being able to develop on it, but at least know what it does. It's an enterprise integration platform. It connects different systems together. But yeah, we kind of assume that we're assuming that you at least know a bit about it. Otherwise, this is going to be a really weird webinar. And in terms of the format of how we go about this, we're going to mostly make this hands-on. So Dave is going to actually just take you through a whole process of doing a migration, and we'll do a few slides, but not many. It's going to be all hands-on, not a lot of slideware. But also, questions most welcome. If you're on StreamYard, they'll come up in the chat. That's where we are. We're in the StreamYard studio. If you're on LinkedIn, I've got some other people in my team on that, so they're going to be able to answer some of your questions on there. So, and of course, there is a call to action, and the call to action is that you need to start planning. The link is also in the chat. The QR code will be at the end. But if you don't make it to the end, maybe you've got to get onto your next meeting. Use this code, book a chat with me, 30 minutes, and at least we can tell you how to go about getting costs and timescales for your migration project. Because that's the first thing you need to know. If you've got costs and timescales, you can start planning what you're going to do, and I can help you get that. So that's the call to action for the webinar. In terms of the agenda, I'm going to talk very, very quickly about the problem space, and then Dave's going to go through the whole deep dive, which is going to talk about the solution and how we go about migrating and all the different, how you migrate all of the different artifacts. And then we're just going to wrap up at the end, hopefully have time for one or two questions, and then we'll be done. So, problem space. Well, unless you've been living in the IT equivalent of a cave for a while, you will know that BizTalk Server is nearing the end of life. And in terms of the product life cycle, Microsoft published all the dates, but only BizTalk 2020 is the only version that is now in mainstream support. BizTalk 2016 is in extended support or life support, as you might look at it, and all other versions are out of support. So if you are on one of those old versions, you're really, you've got a lot of vulnerability in your IT estate there, because you're not even getting security. But not only that, in terms of supportability, a lot of these BizTalk installations are on old servers. When those servers go, are you going to be able to get the parts to them? There's a whole load of issues with not just the software, but the hardware, but then it's getting the right skill, getting the skills. Are you able to develop those? Are you able to keep those maintained? If your applications are changed, do you have the skills in-house to actually move from to the latest version of Oracle or whatever it is. And so a lot of the drive for migration is not because my BizTalk installation doesn't work, but often it is I can't find the skills. My BizTalk applications are stuck, and I need to move on to something that is going to be a bit more dynamic for my business. And that's really where we're finding the key business need. So that is an introduction to the problem space. And now I'm going to hand over to Dave, who'll drive us through the deep dive, and we'll just chat as we go. And any questions, please post them in the chat. Okay, thanks, Dave. Do you want to?
Yeah, thank you.
You like to drive?
Yeah, I'm just need to present my screen. One moment. There you go. Can everyone see my screen? I assume so.
I can.
Good.
If I can, so, everyone else can.
Well, that's a good starting point. So I've developed this migration demo, this webinar, in a virtual machine. So you should only be seeing the contents of my virtual machine. You shouldn't be seeing anything else that I have running. So hopefully you can just see my virtual machine, which I think you can. So Andrew's already mentioned and given an overview of what we're talking about. So we're going to talk about a sample migration project, the BizTalk solution that is built around that sample migration project. We'll talk a little bit about a BizTalk migration tool, which is freely available, which we have been working on and done some enhancements to internally within 345. I'll talk about the Azure solution, and then I'll obviously talk about migrating various BizTalk artifacts. I'm not going to cover every single BizTalk resource that you could possibly create as part of a project, but cover the main ones really. We'll talk a little bit about monitoring and alerting, what you can do in Azure, and then we'll talk a little bit about BAM towards the end. So as part of this webinar, I wanted to build a sample project or two sample projects that would allow us to talk through what you might do in BizTalk and then how you go about building that in Azure. So I've come up with two very simple scenarios, which are quite common ESB patterns, really. So I have a typical ESB pattern where you have one-to-many. So in this case, we've got employee data, and we're going to receive some employee data and send it to two systems, a payroll system and an imaginary HR system. And likewise, another imaginary ESB pattern is a many-to-one, whereby we're receiving customer invoices and I've said customer invoices twice. I hadn't even spotted that, but customer invoices and supplier invoices. And we're going to be sending both of those invoices to a finance system. So the first part of this is just the BizTalk solution. So I'm going to give an overview of the BizTalk solution, what's been developed in Visual Studio, how that runs in the BizTalk admin console, and so on. So the first part I will show is the Visual Studio solution. So here we have our two sample ESB projects. We've got our invoice data and our employee data. So we've got various different artifacts there, and I'll come back to those in a moment. But first, I just wanted to talk through how that looks in a BizTalk environment, because in a production environment, you may be a customer that has a deployment to production, but for whatever reason, the code is no longer available. You might be struggling to find the code, but fundamentally, you'll have a production environment where you've got your BizTalk deployed. So you can see here, I've got my two applications. I've got my invoice data and I've got my employee data. Now, hopefully you can see the contents of the BizTalk admin console. It doesn't scale particularly well. You can't zoom in like you can in most modern applications, but hopefully that's viewable. So
that's because it's not a modern application.
It's not a modern application, no. It's been around for quite a few years now. So within the BizTalk admin console, I've set up my two sample applications, employee data and invoice data. So if I just look into each one of these, you've got your usual receive ports, receive locations, and so on. But I won't talk too much about what that means, because as Andrew mentioned, we expect that most people are from a BizTalk background. So I've got a simple file drop here. And in most scenarios in the production environment, you may have other technologies, HTTP, SOAP, and so on, or many other connectors that for systems you could possibly connect to. So we can receive some employee data via file drop, an orchestration which processes that particular employee and results in it being sent to two destination systems. But in my case, it's just a file drop. And likewise for my invoice data, I've got a couple, 3 receive locations, which can receive different types of invoices. So we've got customer invoice, employee invoice, and again, an orchestration which does some business logic before sending it onto a finance system. So just to give a very typical BizTalk demo, I'm going to drop some files in the folder and see them come out the other end. So if we look at employee, I've got a couple of sample employees here. I'll just open them up just to give you an example. It's a very simple scenario, as I've mentioned. I've got a couple of employees in an XML, and I'm going to kind of use that and drive the BizTalk demo. So I'm going to take a copy of those files, drop them in my in folder. Again, this is a very old school BizTalk style demo, but the old ones are the best. And hopefully what should come out here is, 1411. I've got two files come out. So if we look in some of the samples, again, you're going to have a different XML message coming out, a slightly different format from what was dropped in. But again, that's a common scenario in a BizTalk project where you've got a source message format and a destination message format, and probably a canonical format in the middle. So you can see how that has come out. Oh, sorry, the wrong one there. So XML for the HR system has come out, but also I mentioned there was a payroll system, and you see that here, if I open these up, these are actually flat files. So again, typical BizTalk scenario whereby you might be receiving a flat file and sending it to a system that is XML or JSON, or you might be actually receiving XML and the destination system might be a flat file, which is obviously still quite common.
And this is one of the whole points of having an integration platform, that it does that translation between these different systems.
Yeah. And likewise, for my other scenario, which was my invoice data, which was my many-to-one scenario, I've got a number of files here. So these are actually, the inputs are flat files. So if I drop an input into customer in, and I drop a couple of inputs into supplier in, we should see in finance out a number of messages come out. So again, if we just have a look at these, it's typical BizTalk. I just wanted to open these as well to show an example of some business logic you might have in your orchestration. So you see here, one has come out with an uplift of 0. It doesn't matter too much what the uplift actually means in this scenario, but if I look at one of the others, actually it's going to be the third one, isn't it? Typical. We've got an uplift value of 100 here. So in this case, there's some business logic which is doing something with the message, and it's given a different value for the uplift. But I'll come on to that in a moment. So if we look at the code in Visual Studio, so this is Visual Studio 2019, again, running on my virtual machine. If we just look at the makeup of the employee data project, so we've got our schemas. I won't open each one, but we've got our employee detail schema, which is our input schema. Again, typical in a BizTalk type project or an integration project, you might have a canonical schema, a canonical message format. And then I've got some flat file schemas and so on. I've got my maps, which map from employee to canonical. Again, this is quite a simple BizTalk map, but in many production environments or many real world projects, you may have quite complex maps, and you might have a lot of business logic in there, and you probably want to reuse that business logic because rewriting that map in some other technology might be quite hard. So again, a number of maps, and also you can see how I've got a pipeline component, which is converting from XML to a flat file. And then I've got my orchestration, which doesn't have a lot of business logic, but it has a small amount of business logic. Likewise, if I look at my invoice data project, I've got some schemas. So I've got my flat file schema, which is my input schema, and I've got my output schemas. And again, I've got some maps which map from to canonical and so on. Again, I've got an orchestration here where I mentioned a little bit about some custom business logic. So in this particular case, I've done some logic whereby I determine if it's a customer or a supplier, and if it's a customer or a supplier, if it's a customer, I add an uplift of 100, and if it's not a customer, then I don't add an uplift. Again, just some made-up scenario, but it was to show that you might have some orchestrations with some quite complex business logic. So that is the actual BizTalk solution. That's how it looks in the BizTalk admin console and how it might look in a customer's production environment. So as part of the migration of a BizTalk migration, you can go through and look at your code, and you can look at your schemas, and you can recreate those yourself. But often you may have a complex, mature BizTalk environment with lots of applications, lots of schemas, lots of maps. So where we make use of, what we are going to make use of here is something called the BizTalk migration tool, which is available for download on GitHub. We have been modifying it ourselves to include some functionality that we think benefits our customers. So the main thing is, with this migration tool, you can get some output to allow you to understand the complexity of your BizTalk estate and your environment and so on. To be able to run that BizTalk migration tool, it does mean you need to be able to, you do have to export your MSIs. So in a traditional style within BizTalk, and again, people that know BizTalk will know how to do this. You would export your BizTalk MSI to a particular location, and from there, you can run the BizTalk migration tool. I'm not going to go into full detail of how to set up the migration tool because it could take a whole session in its own right. But fundamentally, there's a command line tool which you can run, which takes the output of your MSIs. So one of the parameters in here is, you'll see, is this, which points to where I've placed the MSIs. And it will go through the MSIs, it will do some analysis, and effectively it will produce some CSV files. It will produce a whole host of CSV files which tells us about what has been deployed, how it's built, how it's made up, and so on. So I'm going to run that tool. And it will go off in the background and do a few things. It's started to run, but so you see how it's analyzing the MSIs, it's created some reports. And in this case, it failed because I think I opened the command prompt in the incorrect location, but that doesn't matter too much because the output of those reports that it produces, we have produced a Power BI template, which allows us to view those. So for my particular project, you can see here how I've opened my Power BI project previously, and it's looking at the output of the migration tool. And it allows me to see things like how many applications I've got, how many maps, orchestrations, pipelines, ports, and so on there are, and the complexity of basically what it thinks the complexity of my BizTalk applications are. You can go through that and understand a little bit more detail by clicking into each of the tables. And for example, here, if I click into orchestrations, it allows me to view details about the orchestrations and effectively some of the things that might be in the orchestration, such as constructs, expressions, calling rules, and so on. And as a result of all those calculations it does, it gives you what it thinks is a complexity of a particular orchestration. Now, for my simple webinar, where I didn't want to add a lot of complexity, it obviously doesn't show really that much complexity. But what I do have is a predefined, pre-built, more complex scenario. So you see here, we've got a number of BizTalk applications, 5 BizTalk applications here, and they're of varying complexity. And you see here, this graph is actually showing, well, there's 87.5% low complexity and 12.5% high complexity. Again, if we go into the actual detail and look at the orchestrations, you can go through those and you can filter and so on, but fundamentally, it will tell you what it thinks is high complexity, low complexity, medium complexity, and so on. Now, why could that be important? In a customer's project where it might be a mature environment and it's existed for quite a number of years, and there may be a lack of documentation or a lack of knowledge of the actual applications, but it still runs. This is going to be key to your migration in terms of helping us when we migrate your project from BizTalk to Azure, helping us to understand the complexity of your applications. And that will help with planning and design and migration and so on. So fundamentally, we think this is really important in any BizTalk migration project to Azure. Running some sort of migration where you can get some output, get some metrics, and basically understand what you have and what you don't have at the moment. So that's a little bit about the BizTalk sample project I set up and the migration project, and how you can use this tool to give you some really deep understanding of what you might have if you don't have that documentation or you don't have any employees that understand your applications anymore. This tool will go through based on some predefined rules and actually do that analysis for you. So before I move on to the Azure solution, Andrew, is there anything you want to add to what we've talked about in terms of the BizTalk side of things and the migration project?
Yeah, so one of the things I've just posted in the comments on StreamYard, but I've got it on the screen here, is there is a GitHub project for the migration tool, and that's a core tool that's been around for a few years. Now, some of the things that Dave is showing with the way the data is output and going into Power BI, those are our modifications on that. So quite happy to talk to you if you want to run a migration tool and get some of these modifications. Quite happy to, again, you get the link to chat to me at the end of it, but do get in touch because we can help you with that data.
Yeah, and just to answer Stuart's question, maps can be converted into XSLT. Yes, that would be part of what I show when I show how to recreate this within Azure. So at the moment, I've just been showing BizTalk and the BizTalk maps, but when you come to take your BizTalk solution and recreate it in Azure, I'll be talking about how you can reuse your schemas and your maps, and you need to convert your maps to XSLT like Stuart has said, so I'll come on to that. So the next part I'm going to move on to then is, I'll just skip forward a few slides, is how to replicate in Azure. So fundamentally, logic apps are the cornerstone to any of this migration. In BizTalk, you can have messaging-only solutions, or you can have more complex solutions that involve orchestration. But in Azure, logic apps are the cornerstone of whatever you're doing, really, be it processing a simple file and sending it somewhere else, or having more complex business logic. Effectively, in a solution migrating from BizTalk to Azure, where you've got PubSub, BizTalk message box, effectively, you're going to be using service bus, topics and subscriptions to replicate the logic that you might get in message box. You could, of course, use event grade, but in this scenario, we're going to be really talking about service bus. So if I just go over to here and look at this, so I've got a service bus namespace, which has a couple of topics. So I've got my invoice details topic and my employee details topic. So again, that's just replicating my simple scenarios I set up as part of my earlier diagram and set up as part of my BizTalk environment. I just drill into these. You see how I've got a subscription for finance. And again, in BizTalk, you might have some quite complex filtering rules in terms of, if I just jump back into my BizTalk actually and show one, you might have some complex filters here. So I've just got some filters set up where I'm filtering on the message type. Yeah, sorry, just on the comment, right click on your map. Yeah, I was going to come on to that about how to validate the map and upload it into Azure. So you can see here I've got some filters. You may have more complex filters in your real world scenario, but you can recreate those filters in your service bus topic. So here I've just got the default filter, which is basically an evaluation of true, and that will mean that subscription will process the message, but you can have any number of complex subscription filters. For my employee details, I've got two subscriptions, HR and payroll. And again, I won't go into each of those because I'm not doing any particular filtering logic on that. So for this migration, service bus is key to this. Talked about logic apps. The thing that I'm not going to talk about really is the networking and the setting up of the VNets, the private endpoints, and so on, because I think that could take quite a long time in its own right. So my setup in my Azure environment is quite straightforward. I've not set up any VNets, no private endpoints, but again, that would be a separate topic for conversation. And in fact, Andrew could tell you all about 345 Air and how 345 Air can help with setting up your production-like environment. So if I now go to my demo, and again, I'm not going to talk too much just at this moment in time how to reuse the schemas and the maps and how to recreate your orchestrations as logic apps. I'm just literally going to demo some items. So here I've got a simple employee, and it's the same employee detail that I showed before. I'm just going to change this number. I'm going to submit a message via HTTP to my logic app. I'm actually going to send it 5, 6, 7 times, and I'll come on to why I'm doing this in a moment. But I want to do this now because it'll give me time for the processes to run and execute. So I've submitted an employee. It has gone through the logic, and if I go to my output location, which in this case is a storage account, so I've got my employee human resources, which here 425, that message has come out. So again, this is the same XML that would have came out of my BizTalk project, and also my payroll again should be the same. Actually, I'm just going to delete those and send some more. So you see here, I've got two new messages arrive, and if I open one of them up, you see it's the same flat file format that I demonstrated from BizTalk. So if I go back into BizTalk just to show that it is the same format, employee data out payroll, we can see it's the same flat file format. So I'm reusing the same structures, the same messages, and so on. So that's the.
You can tell why we all end up wearing glasses, can't you? Because it's just. But yeah, so one of the things that's really, one of the things just to point out while Dave's doing that is, as you can see from looking at the Azure, the Azure portal, there's so much more richness in the operational data you get on the information in every run. But that's also just a big benefit that you get out of the box without even having to do anything.
Yeah, and I'm going to touch a little bit about that in a short while. I'm just going to give a quick demo of the other scenario I gave, which was the customer invoice. So I'm going to drop. Actually, I'm just going to make sure these are clear. Yeah, these are clear. So I'm going to drop. So again, I'm just replicating my customer and supplier invoices. So I will upload some invoices here. So I'll drop that. Again, it's the same input file that I used for my BizTalk demo. I'll drop that in and upload. And I'll do the same for supplier invoice. I'll drop that in and upload. And then if I go into my output location, I should have 3 messages. Now, if I open those up, we'll see the same XML format that came out before. You see there's an uplift there of a different number, and I'll explain that in a moment. But we've also got an uplift here, which should be 0, hopefully. Yeah, so this uplift is 0. So again, I've created my simple BizTalk projects in Azure, and now I'm just going to talk a little bit about how the logic apps work and so on, and how you reuse those schemas and maps. Like a couple of people have mentioned, already said that, yeah, you right click on the map and you generate the XSLT. That's kind of what I'm going to touch on now. So I've created a BizTalk, sorry, not BizTalk, I've created a logic app, the logic app standard in Azure portal. I've got some workflows, but I'm first, before I talk through the workflows and how they work, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the schemas. So within your logic app standard, you can upload your schemas straight out the box. So all you would do normally here would be you'd go to your location where you've got your XSDs, and you'd basically add your schemas in here. So you can drag from your file explorer, you can drag the schemas onto here, or you can browse for them. Again, I'm not going to do that here because I've already done that. And like a couple of the comments have said, you need to upload the XSLT. So I've already uploaded the XSLT, but effectively what the comments are talking about is when you've got a BizTalk map, you can't reuse that directly. So what you have to do is right click on the map, validate the map, and that will give you an XSL in this location. So if I take this, go to here. Oh, I didn't copy it properly. I take this and go to here. This will generate the XSL. Now, you have to rename that to XSLT, and that gives you the XSLT that you can then upload directly into the portal, into the maps folder. If you want, and many customers will do this, You can do all of this through VS Code. So there's VS Code extensions, but again, I'm not going to go into too much detail about VS Code and how to develop in VS Code for logic apps. But again, if you've got a proper CI/CD process, you can upload your schemas and maps into the artifacts folder. And when you do the deployment of your logic app, your schemas and your maps will be uploaded. So that's reusing many of the BizTalk artifacts that you might have, because much of the logic that you might have and much of the conversion from one format to another will be done through your XSLT. The other part, of course, is the workflows, and this is where we'll start talking about receive ports and send ports and so on. So like I mentioned in BizTalk, you can have a messaging only solution. So over here for my employee data, I've got a receive port whereby, oh no, sorry, it's not that one. For my invoice data, I've got a receive port here whereby I've got 3 receive ports and 3 receive locations. My receive locations actually have a receive pipeline. So if we remember, I dropped in some CSV files for my customer demo, so my invoice demo. So these were CSV files. In BizTalk, of course, everything has to be XML. So you have to convert the CSV to XML. Now, to do that, you need to implement a pipeline. So we've got a pipeline component here that you would need to replicate. You've got a receive port where you might have some maps that you execute. And that's what you need to replicate in Azure. Now, there's no messaging only solution in Azure. As I mentioned earlier, you have to do everything via a logic app. So if I just now go through some of the logic app workflows that I've created. So I've got my employee. So if I click into one of these, so you see I've got my run history for the items I've been running. But the key thing here is the design view. So you see how I've, again, it's very much a workflow driven approach, and ignore the little bit about the BAM tracking for now. I'm going to come on to that later, but you can see how I'm replicating much of what's done in the BizTalk solution. So I've got XML validation for my message. And again, so out of the box in Logic App Standard, you can use the XML actions for validation and transform. So here I'm doing XML validation of my incoming message. And it's just allowing me to go through and pick the particular schema. So again, this is the schema straight out of BizTalk without any modifications. And the transform, where I'm transforming from my employee to my canonical, again, the XSLT that I uploaded, it allows me to select that straight away. And then in this case, I'm sending off to Service Bus, and I've just got my connection to Service Bus, and I'm sending my transformed message.
So I think one of the key things here, though, is that when you say there's no pure messaging solution in Logic Apps, well, there kind of is, because this is a pure messaging solution. The thing is that a Logic App is so much more flexible than the BizTalk framework, because BizTalk forces you into a certain pattern of receive location with the adapter, pipeline, message box, which can then either go to orchestration engine and then send port, which is pipeline and adapter. However, with the Logic App, you can string together a connector, which is equivalent with an adapter, but then you can have all the bits in that Logic App Dave show. They're like pipeline components. But then you can go to a message box, which is like Service Bus, or you could just go straight to your destination. You've got so much more flexibility, but you can do all the same things. It's just BizTalk makes you do them as, here's a pipeline component, here's an orchestration. Whereas actually we've got a lot more flexibility now to recombine those bits to make a much more flexible solution.
And by messaging only solution, what I was referring to really from a BizTalk perspective was you can come up with a solution without having to go into Visual Studio and without having to create an orchestration. So by messaging only, I meant being able to use config within BizTalk to create an end-to-end solution. But you can replicate all of that in Logic Apps. So we'll just go through some of the other, as an example, my payroll system, which was my flat file, been dropped out again. It's not doing much other than transforming XML from canonical to a flat file. So again, there are actions within Logic App Standard where you can do flat file encoding or flat file decoding. And again, you can literally just reuse your BizTalk schema you've already got. So here I've selected the same BizTalk schema that I used for sending to my payroll system, and I just selected it from the list. So again, from a send port perspective, much like a receive port, you can recreate your business logic, you can apply your pipeline and so on within the logic apps. I won't go into each logic app, but I just wanted to touch on my little bit of business logic that I had in my map here. Sorry, within this project, my employee data project. So no, this is my canonical invoice project. So here, where I do have a little bit of business logic, I just want to show how you would do something similar to that. So when we're processing the canonical invoice, which is over here, receive invoice, sorry, send invoice finance. If we look at the logic app, again, you're receiving a message from the service bus, transforming it from the canonical to your finance data. But then, like I had in my BizTalk orchestration, I've got a little bit of logic to determine the invoice type. So is the invoice type a customer? When I showed the output of the message and we saw an uplift, I've replicated that in a quite straightforward way. And I've actually done it two ways because I wanted to show there's multiple ways of doing these things. But what I'm doing here is determining if the invoice is a customer and then effectively changing something in the output data. So in my output, I'm saying here, if the invoice type is a customer, I'm setting the uplift to 39393. Why I chose that, who knows, but I must have typed that at the time. But I'm using one of the out-of-the-box actions here, XML Compose, where you can reconstruct your XML and change your XML. But I also done it in a different way, just to show you can do more custom logic, like you might be able to do in BizTalk orchestration. So again, I've done the same thing using JSON parse and using JavaScript to modify my outputs. So again, there's multiple ways you can do these things. You can use out-of-the-box actions, or you can use custom script and so on. Now, one of the things I did want to touch on in relation to migrating receive ports, send ports, and orchestrations, in BizTalk, of course, when you've got a message and it's going through a receive port, it's persisted in the message box, and then the orchestration picks it up from the message box, and the orchestration will do something, and it may push it back into the message box. In my solution here, my logic app workflow, I've combined all of that logic into one. If you were rebuilding this, you might decide you want to have one logic app that purely does the mapping. So whilst here I'm doing the mapping to the canonical format, you might have a logic app that receives the message and maps it to the canonical format and then submits it to service bus. And then you might have another logic app that actually picks it up from that service bus to QR topic and does the business logic. I've combined the actual mapping and the business logic into one logic app workflow here, but you could do it independently and separately if you wanted to. So that's a little bit about my logic apps and migrating of the maps and schemas and so on. Anything else you want to add on that, Andrew, before I move on to just talking a little bit about monitoring and alerting?
Not really. I mean, I think the point here, and it's just following on from what we're saying, is that we've just been replicating a BizTalk. We're trying to do a like for like. This is what it looks like in BizTalk. This is what it looks like in Azure. But yeah, when you do a migration, you do get a chance to re-engineer. So
yeah,
that's but we're just trying to just show the equivalent at the moment.
Yeah. And my scenarios were really quite simple and straightforward, and majority of scenarios will be much more complex than this. But I'm just trying to show what you might be able to do. So I just want to talk a little bit about monitoring and alerting. So monitoring out of the box in BizTalk, you were kind of limited to using the BizTalk admin console, tracked message events and so on. So again, this will be familiar to people. You've got tracked message events where you can look at the message details, and you can, assuming you've got tracking turned on for your receive ports and send ports and so on, you can look at the messages that are flowing through your system. In a production environment, you might have tracking turned off because obviously it takes database storage space, persisting every message and so on, every tracked message. You can look at your tracked service instances again. So if we look through here and we look at a tracked orchestration, you can use the orchestration debugger to look at the flow through your particular orchestration. So you can see here, you can go through that and you can see what's been executed. From a point of view of out of the box alerting and so on, you don't necessarily get much out of the box. You've got BAM that you can use, and I'll talk a little bit about BAM in relation to Azure later. You've got your perf mon counters that you can set up to monitor your health of your BizTalk environment. But fundamentally, day to day, if you're looking at your BizTalk solution, you might use the BizTalk admin console to look what's going on, unless you develop some sort of custom monitoring solution yourself. Now, in Azure, you get so much more. So one of the things I wanted to show was the monitoring blade of the Logic app. So I think Andrew touched on this earlier. Out of the box, you get so much more in terms of monitoring. So you can see here, I've been, in the last 7 days, I've done a few tests. Obviously, if I just click on the last hour, you can see how I've obviously executed a few tests, and I've sent some employees and I've sent some invoices. The thing I wanted to touch on a little bit was the alerting and the out-of-box alerting, which is really quite powerful. So I'd already set up an alert. So hopefully if I filter on this, I'm just going to zoom out a little bit. So I've set up some alerts, and I've set up some alerts, which is a made-up scenario, but I'm basically saying, if I receive too many employees, I want to send an alert. Hopefully, if I go to my email over here, you should see at 14:35, which was when I was clicking this a few times, I basically sent 10 messages, and it's sent me alert to say, oh, you've created too many employees, and you see it's then deactivated that alert. So I just wanted to touch a little bit on this and show you how you can do something quite simple. Where's my browser gone? Oh, over here. So in my alert, if I have a look at that and look at my alert rules, so I set up an alert that said too many employees. If I click on edit, and so you see here, I've selected a signal, workflow runs completed. Now there's a whole host of other things you can do. You can use infrastructure signals such as CPU time and response time and so on. But I've decided to just show the power of how quickly you can set up an alert to say, alert me when there's greater than a certain number of workflow runs. You might be a valid business scenario, it might not be. Out of the box, I set up this alert to say, if it's greater than 5, for my receive employee, send an email to my email address. So again, if I click on this, I just put in some details and I've entered my own email address, and it allows me to really quite quickly monitor your Logic Apps environment in a way that you couldn't easily do with BizTalk. BizTalk, you had SCOM, of course, and you could do quite a lot with SCOM and other monitoring tools, but it was, I think everyone would probably agree, it was quite time consuming to set up, and it took a lot of effort. But out of the box with Logic Apps, you've got so much more. You can actually go into these alerts as well. And if I change the user response and say acknowledged, and I type something in there, again, it doesn't matter too much what I type, I should get an alert in a few moments to say that has been resolved. But again, I just wanted to touch on how easy it was to set up alerting and so on. Again, you've got your metrics, which you can look at all your usual infrastructure things like CPU, memory count, and so on. And again, you can alert on all of those things. That's a little bit on the monitoring and alerting. I'm just conscious of time and that we want to leave some time at the end to talk about, for questions. But the next bit I wanted to talk about was just BAM. So if I zoom down to here. So BAM within BizTalk, I always found it was quite cumbersome now, and I found in many of the BizTalk projects I've done over the years, it wasn't really used much because I think because it was so cumbersome, people tended to avoid it. Now I know there's other projects that many of the 3, 4, 5 people have worked on that have made significant use of BAM, and they'll probably tell you some interesting stories about it. But
it didn't mean it was easy to use, though.
No, it didn't. No, and I've heard
that BAM is so important.
Yeah.
I mean, just because BizTalk had a really difficult to use BAM implementation,
Yeah.
didn't take away from the fact that BAM's really important because it's what is going on in your business right now.
Yeah.
Not from a technical perspective of which component is failing, but from a business process perspective, what is happening.
Yeah.
And every business needs that. Every business has got processes, and every business needs to know how they're doing.
Yeah. So what I'm going to demonstrate here is the BAM module from Turbo 360 from Kovai. So Turbo 360, most people are probably familiar with it, is the successor to BizTalk 360, which some of you may have used on your BizTalk projects. And it used to be serverless 360 and so on. But I'm making use of the BAM module to show how important it is and the benefit you can get out of using a tool such as this. I know that Microsoft have introduced business process and tracking into Logic Apps, currently in preview, but it's much more technically focused. It's part of the Azure portal. I would say it's more of a second line, third line support tool to view your flow of your messages and so on. But from a first line support or a business user, BAM is really important. Business users like to be able to understand what's going on, like to be able to look at the messages themselves. They don't want to go into the Azure portal and look at all the technical details. So we're going to talk a little bit about Turbo 360. So as I mentioned, it's aimed at business users, first line support. There are two approaches to it, and I'm only going to show one of them here. So there's the custom login approach, and there's also a data queries approach. The custom login makes heavy use of Turbo 360 APIs, and you basically you instrument your logic apps in such a way that you send the appropriate data. And then the data queries view was also something that you can build on top of any KQL queries you might have in your logic apps. So I'm just going to go into the demo here and talk a little bit about Turbo 360. So over here, just refreshing my screen, you should see that I entered an order number 43, and it's already gone through and it's appeared in Turbo 360. So I've got actually 3 transactions that I've created, and that allows me to get a good, from a business perspective, a good understanding of what's going on. Now, if I click into each one, I'll come on to the details in a moment of how to do this, but you can go through your business process or what you've tracked from your business process, and you can view details of the message. So you see here, I can go into the details and look at the messages. So I've got my message body that I can track. I've got custom properties such as work ID. If I go into my send to payroll, send to HR, again, there's some items of my business process that I'm tracking. So again, if I click on some of these, you can look at the output of those items. And again, it's very much a business user focus, and it's presented in a much nicer way. So you see here, if I wanted to, I can allow my business users to go in and track the status of a particular work ID, and look at the details of what's happened within the system without them having to get in touch with support people. And there may be valid business reasons why they need to do that, because there might be a customer on the end of the phone to the account manager. The account manager might decide, well, actually, I'll check to see if it's sent to the HR department and so on. So in Turbo 360, and again, I'm not going to go into a great amount of detail on this, but I wanted to show how you can achieve this. So you can set up what's called transactions. So I've got an inbound transaction and an outbound transaction. I'm basically just saying which of these stages of my business process do I want to track. So I'm tracking here, validating my message and sending it to service bus for my employee data. And for my HR, again, I'm just tracking my canonical message and sending to Blob. Now, what I did want to show was how do you do this? So if I go into my Logic Apps, where's that gone? So I've only instrumented it for my employee scenario. So if I go into here and look in the design view, so I did say before, ignore those BAM tracking pieces, but this is where I'm going to talk about them. So to instrument your tracked process, your Turbo 360 transaction, you basically need to make some API calls. And what you do within your Logic app, and you can do this from function apps as well. It's all it is an API call at the end of the day. you go in and you configure your HTTP action with your URL. So there's a start transaction endpoint and there's a checkpoint endpoint. But all you're saying here is, I want to track a particular process, and you give it some details about that business process that you want to track. So again, these are just HTTP headers. You can track the message body and you can track custom headers and so on. So you see here, all I'm doing is saying, I want to track a particular business process flow by calling the Turbo 360 API. So I've got start tracking, which initiates the process, which would be the equivalent of starting my my receive employee. So this will start this receive employee transaction. But any other stage of your business process that you want to track, you would then make another call to Turbo 360, but to a different API, to a checkpoint API. Again, you have to pass details of your business process, your transaction, and other details you want to send. What is key to this is tying it all together. So you might ask, if you're calling these APIs, how do you tie them all together so you've got a holistic end-to-end transaction? What you do have to do is store a unique GUID or get the output of the first call in a unique GUID and use that all the way through your transactions. You've got this transaction instance ID that you have to make sure you pass around so that all of the transactions hang together. But it is really quite simple. You define your business process in Turbo 360. Just waiting for this to load. And then you just instrument your code with each of those API calls. And I wouldn't create this again now, but if I was doing it, it would probably take me 10, 15 minutes to recreate this scenario. It is really that straightforward. But the benefit you get from this is, of course, I know that if I go through the last hour, you can look at the details of what I've done in the last hour. You can search for things like, so I've got 2, 3, 4, 42. You can filter your BAM data. You can, again, you can allow your business users to query the data and do what they need to do to find out the health of the system and what's going on and so on. So it is really quite powerful. So you get the end-to-end business process overview. You can instrument as much of your code as you want. You can track as much data as you want, but that effectively is quite a powerful tool for doing end-to-end business activity monitoring. I'm just conscious of time, so I think that's kind of me done, really, Andrew.
That's great, thank you, Dave. Just, I mean, just on the BAM, if you'd like us to run another session where we can actually do a BAM deep dive, then let us know. Feel free to ping us in the comments or just get in touch offline, because it is a big topic. And I mean, tools like Turbo 360 just got a lot of functionality for how you let certain business users view certain business processes and all that kind of thing. There's a whole security model around it. It's really good stuff. So if you'd like to know more about that, let us know. But what I'm going to do now is I am going to just move over. Move over, and I've got the wrong screen there. So I'm going to move on to this screen and then go, we're going to conclude. And so the key takeaways from this really is, in many ways, the technology is the easy bit. The technology always behaves itself. It's understanding what your BizTalk app to do that's the hard thing. Now, the fact is, as Dave said about the migration tool, is that all the code is already baked into BizTalk. So when you deploy an application into BizTalk, it's actually got the source code, the orchestration, designer shapes, the schemas, the maps. They're all actually baked in to that BizTalk application that gets deployed. And so when we run the migration tooling over it, we can uncrack that and we can get all that BizTalk application, and we can understand what it does. So following that approach, we can then help you migrate effectively, because we can break this thing down into bite-sized pieces, and then using the techniques Dave has shown, we can then do the migration. But the other thing is that you should absolutely start planning now. BizTalk is reaching end of life. The hardware you've got it running on is probably reaching end of life. You're going to find it harder and harder and harder to find the skills to support it. So start planning. And the first thing you need to do to start planning is obviously you need to find out costs and timescales. So I'd love to help you with that. Even if you're going to do the migration yourself, just understanding what's involved, what the complexity is, what the technical risks are, everything you need to be able to plan a migration, we can do that for you. So please, feel free to just book in a little chat with me, talk about what you want to do, what your timescales for your migration are, and then I can tell you how we can get you that key information for planning. And that is, firstly, well, that's pretty much everything on our deck. So what I'm going to do now is just, well, let's go there and let's just do a recap of some of the questions that have come through. We've been answering a lot of them in the chat, but we'll just do a bit of a recap. So, Nathan's been asking what the biggest benefit of Azure over BizTalk. Now, that's a really hard one to answer because there are so many potential benefits, and depending on what your situation is, different ones are going to be the main one. But have you got sort of a thought?
A favourite, my favourite.
What's your favourite?
My favourite, elasticity. I think oftentimes on a BizTalk project or any on-premises project, you had to think so much upfront about your hardware and how much you wanted to spend on your hardware. Azure, of course, you've got the whole elastic nature of different SKUs and dynamic changing of SKUs and so on. So in terms of costs, operational costs, so much cheaper, because often many BizTalk customers had a really expensive BizTalk production environment with lots of expensive hardware, and they weren't really doing a great deal of high throughput scenarios. It may have been important business transactions for them, but not really making use of the underlying platform they had. With Azure, it's a big fraction of the cost of
Yeah, I mean,
what it might have been.
A customer of ours who many years ago were on BizTalk, and they spent significant amounts on their BizTalk estate, because 6 hours a month they had to do a massive load of work, and that sized the whole thing. And actually with Azure they could have just auto scaled up 6 hours, scale back down, and literally probably paid 1% of the cost. That's a great one. Just going through, obviously there's the thing about XSLT. How long does it take to run the migration tool? Well, actually, it takes about 10 seconds.
Yeah.
Once you've got your MSIs, you put them in the folder, you run the command line. It will literally just whiz through them, spit that data out. So running the tooling is really quick. Understanding the results from it, a little bit longer. But again, the technology behaves itself. That's the easy bit. Warren here's commenting on the BAM thing, that there's Nodonite's also a great tool. I'm keen to hear anyone that's got any experience of that, and particularly any product comparison between the different products on the market. But it's definitely one worth looking at. And Andrew C. So some customers might utilize build or CI servers that run end-to-end acceptance tests. How could this best be achieved on Azure? Are there any preferred tools? This is an interesting one, actually, because one of the things that was difficult about BizTalk was, unit testing was quite hard. You could unit test pipeline components, you could unit test pipelines, and you could unit test maps and schemas, but actually orchestrations had to be deployed and run through the orchestration engine. So actually, if you move on to Logic App's standard runtime, you can actually test those locally, because they will actually execute on the functions runtime, which you can which you can install locally. So actually, some of the testability is actually a lot better now. I mean, there's still the thing about having to get a build agent that's got all that stack on it. Have you got any thoughts on that, Dave?
Yeah, I've used two tools really in the various Azure projects I've done over the years. Primarily Azure DevOps, integrated with some sort of GitHub repository that you can obviously build your pipeline to do your CI/CD, end-to-end acceptance tests. Again, you might write some sort of automated tests that you run against the deployment. So you might have a pipeline, does the deployment, run some tests. Again, there would primarily be end-to-end tests, like you might have done in BizTalk. But there's other tools such as Octopus Deploy. Again, you could build up a similar pipeline where you do a deployment, execute some tests, and so on. I know Microsoft have done quite a lot of work on this in terms of they're providing mechanisms to allow you to unit test logic apps as well. So I don't think we have time to cover that because we've gone over slightly, but there are quite a few options, end-to-end tests as part of your CI/CD pipeline, or unit tests of logic apps and so on, that you can combine into your pipelines as well.
Yeah, so there's a whole conversation there, but there's a lot of, you've got a lot of possibilities depending on exactly what your CI/CD process is.
Sounds like another webinar there, doesn't it?
It does. It does. Thank you for that. We always want to know topics for the next one. And we've got a message here from Stuart, just more of a comment really, saying that enterprise Mindshift has changed away from centralized orchestrations into loosely coupled and reactive. I mean, I think that the very nature of cloud has made in some ways the big monolithic platform less of a thing. Having said that, MuleSoft are still quite happy to sell you a big monolithic platform. So who knows? Those of us that are kind of working in Azure and able to make really small, cheap things and then loosely couple those together, then yeah, that all makes sense. But there's still people making products with big price tags that do everything. So it's it's an interest. Oh, Stuart's clarified difference between BizTalk and Azure. So yeah, absolutely, Stuart, absolutely. It's there's a whole different paradigm there. Although, if you wanted to lift a BizTalk app into Azure, you could make it as, the architecture is very similar, but
just one point to make on one point to make on the cost there that you mentioned, Andrew. Your Azure environment can end up costing you a lot of money if you don't do it in the right way as well. So that's an important point.
This is true, and I think, I mean, certainly that's a whole nother topic as well, isn't it? But again, from what we've seen, I think when you've got a lot of people trying to do a lot of stuff really fast, they often duplicate the infrastructure. Don't think about, tick the auto scale button. Let's not worry about performance. Let's tick auto scale, and and then Microsoft aren't going to say no to that because it's very lucrative for them. But as with all things, if you don't plan your capacity, if you don't make it efficient, the difference with cloud is it doesn't fall over in a heap as readily. It just costs you a lot. Performance issues manifest themselves in high costs rather than rather than the whole thing falling over in a heap straight away. So
your CEO might fall over in a heap when he gets the bill, but
yeah, but then but then you probably won't have the knowledge to know that you could have done something different.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. I think that's all the questions and comments that we've seen on StreamYard. Thanks so much for those. It's really, really great to hear from you. And we're going to wrap up now. So keep your ears out for the next episode. We've had plenty of thought ideas they've come along for what we can do next. So stay in touch, because at the end of April we'll be doing the next one. So yeah, we'll be in touch, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Cheers.